Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. My name is Steve Lee. I'm going to be the moderator. You're going to see me at the beginning, and then I'm going to actually sit down here and moderate our debate participants is what we'll be doing. So I'm not going to be up here much at all until at the very end we'll do some Q&A, some question and answers at the end, which I'll give more directions for that. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to introduce our debate participants, and as I call their names, if you can come forward and they can associate your name with a face. The first person I'd like to introduce is JT Eberhard. JT. JT is the author of the popular blog, What Would JT Do? He's the co-founder of Skepticon, and he's the high school organizer for the Secular Student Alliance. Thank you, JT. Our next debate participant is John Ferrer. John Ferrer is professor at the Tarrant County College, Texas Wesleyan University, and Pantego Christian Academy. He teaches philosophy, logic, ethics, world religions, church history, and Christian apologetics. Our next debate participant is Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is the president of the Atheist community of Austin and host of the Atheist Experience TV show and the Nonprofits podcast. Thanks, Matt. And our last debate participant is Dr. Robert Sloan Lee. Sloan has earned his MA and PhD in philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit. He teaches logic and philosophy at the Cambridge School of Dallas and is the director of the Philosophy of Religion discussion group called the Dallas Socratic Society. He's married and has a 6-year-old daughter who wants to become a paleontologist when she grows up. Thank you. Usually with debates, it's usually one side against the other, one affirmative, one negative. Today, obviously, we have an interesting format with 4 participants. And so what I'd like to lay out the guidelines and the debate format for us so you'll know what's coming. What we do is the debate topic is a question: does God exist? We'll have affirmative side, and on my right, your left is the affirmative with John and Robert Sloan Lee, and on the left side, my left side, your right side is the negative side with Matt and JT. The affirmative side traditionally opens, and that will be the case today. And what will happen is the affirmative side both participants on the affirmative side will open, both with the 10-minute opening, and then after both of them do their opening, the negative statement will be given, both 10 minutes apiece as well. Then we'll have a 10-minute strategy break. It'll be an opportunity for maybe you to get up and stretch, go to the restroom. But after 10 minutes, which I will be timing, and we'll come right back after the 10 minutes, we'll come back with rebuttals. And again, we'll start with the affirmative. Both affirmatives will give a 5-minute rebuttal each, and the negative a 5-minute rebuttal as well. And then we'll go to a closing statement of 5 minutes for both affirmatives and 5 minutes each for both negative. Then we'll have about a 30-second to minute break because we'll be changing out the tape in the back for filming purposes, and we'll go to question and answer time. And during that time, I'll give more directions of where to line up. I will be holding the mic and how we'll do the question and action function in that regard. With that, I'm going to go ahead and sit down, and when I direct the affirmative side to begin, they may.
Greetings, fellow truth seekers. Thank you, Secular Student Alliance, for inviting me here. It is a pleasure to join in this debate to exchange ideas with Matt and JT, and it's an honor to work again with Sloan. I'd like for all of us to take off our hats for a moment, theists and non-theists alike. Let us take off any antagonism or presumption. Let's open our worldview to critique. We can all learn from each other, even if we disagree. So, let's start afresh, aspiring to be truly free thinkers in the classic sense. Listen to the arguments and let's weigh the evidence together. Today, I'm defending theism with three arguments, which together show God exists. First is the moral argument. Second is the burden of proof argument, focused not on positive atheism, but on the negative or presumptive atheism, which refrains from God belief and thus presumes to have no burden of proof. Third, I will argue that natural causes plus a divine cause provide the better explanatory set than nature alone does. First, the moral argument for God's existence. Premise 1. Objective moral values exist, such as justice, courage, and human dignity. Matt and JT already agree with me on this. Premise 2. Objective moral values imply an objective moral grounding. Therefore, we may conclude that objective moral grounding exists. By objective, I mean they are binding even if the person or culture disagrees. To my knowledge, Matt and JT grant that objective moral values exist. But with premise 2, we disagree. Objective moral grounding is implied because the alternatives fail, namely moral relativism and nature-based models. Now, relativism fails because, first, it trivializes morality, making rape is evil into rape is yucky, I don't like rape, and neither should you. Or worse, I'm biologically preconditioned to dislike rape. Second, it prevents cross-cultural judgments. And third, it discriminates against minority ethical views like saying Martin Luther King was wrong on civil rights. But if we abandon relativism and stick to naturalism, we find nature can't provide objective moral values since nature simply is what is and knows nothing of what ought to be. This is the classic is-ought fallacy, also known as the naturalistic fallacy. Nature fails since it's not a mind, but it takes a mind to make moral claims like we ought to flourish and be happy. Since nature can't offer prescriptions like that, our morals lack a reference point, no truth maker. Since morality of that sort is truthless and thereby toothless. We're inventing prescriptions, but that's relativism, and that's precisely what I just showed to fail. Therefore, since the alternatives fail, the fact of objective, binding moral values testify that God exists. My second argument is a negative case against presumptive atheism. Classical or positive atheism says no God exists. However, a common form of atheism these days is negative atheism, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the normal position of both of my opponents. But they're more than welcome to have changed their mind. That's the purview of any free thinker. I call it presumptive atheism, this negative form, because in abstaining from God belief, they presume to have no burden of proof. For negative or presumptive atheism to be rational, it must have sufficient evidence to justify withholding any belief in God. However, the evidential case for presumptive atheism is wanting, making it no safe bet for rational people. Likewise, positive or classical atheism is even less tenable given the following 10 lines of evidence. First, presumptive atheism presumes the religious experiences of billions of people across the globe and across human history are not any kind of prima facie evidence, that is, evidence on the face of things, or ostensive evidence. Or worse, presumptive atheism treats all of them as being wrong until proven right. But God belief is a cultural universal. Realists are justified in treating God as ostensibly true until the believers or God belief are proven non-credible. Furthermore, it's odd to do as atheists often do and lump God belief into the same category as Santa Claus, the Truth Fairy, or the ubiquitous flying spaghetti monster, when so many people agree on a God and yet reject those other characters. And it's one thing for a skeptic to say he's never had a genuine religious experience. It's another to tell someone that they haven't either, and still worse, to say that neither have the countless others across the globe and human history. Second and third, presumptive atheism presumes that none of the thousands of miracles or revelational claims are worthy of belief, yet only one need be right to vindicate theism. Fourth, we are neurologically hardwired for theism. According to reports by Michael Brooks, Bruce Hood, and Justin Barrett, human beings are neurologically hardwired to believe in God. If these studies are correct, then we can't assume people are natural-born atheists. Moreover, we're hardwired to seek causes for things, trust our ideas can correspond to reality, and believe that logic, math, observation, and inference tell us about the world. These are all hardwirings that we have. Before skeptics dismiss theistic hardwiring out of hand, they should also empty every other bit of hardwiring from their cognitive grasp. Fifth, presumptive atheism presumes that natural causes can potentially explain everything. Atheism says nature is all there is, yet all the ways to prove that scientifically are circular. I grant the spectrum of natural causes, but see no reason to think they explain it all. Sixth, presumptive atheism treats billions of cases of apparent design as illusory with no counterexample, yet only one need be right to vindicate theism. Seventh and eighth, the origin of the universe and life escapes presumptive atheists. Ninth, presumptive atheism militates against positive atheists, telling them that there just isn't enough evidence against God to rationally merit denying God's existence. 10th, presumptive atheism is compatible with God's existence. Most tellingly, since presumptive atheism does not make a claim about reality per se, but about psychology, that is, I refrain from belief in God, therefore I am a negative atheist, it is compatible with God's existence in reality out there. But if atheism can be true while God exists, then it's not much of an atheism. Given these evidences, presumptive atheism is unrealistically skeptical. A better alternative is to treat God belief as an operating hypothesis, prima facie true, and still worthy of inquiry. My third argument concerns the explanatory power of theism. Supernatural plus natural causes are a better explanatory set than natural causes alone. The better explanation is more likely true, therefore theism is likely true. The beauty of atheism is it embraces all natural causes in the world. I'm sorry, let me repeat. The beauty of theism, that would have been bad. The beauty of theism is it embraces all natural causes in the world and then some. Natural science can't tell us nature is a closed system. That comes from philosophy, from metascience. Nothing for or against God can come from science unless it interweaves with theology. Yet what we know of effects in nature suggests natural causes are not the best explanation for the origin of the universe, the existence of life, information and meaning, design, the origin of consciousness in human minds, religious experience, and some miracle claims. By Occam's razor, we don't need to propose limitless causes beyond those needed to explain the data, so monotheism is a better hypothesis than either atheism or polytheism. To sum up, my first argument is that the fact of objectively binding moral value suggests a moral mind beyond us humans. Second, I showed that atheism is no safe assumption, but carries its own burden of proof on pain of irrationality. And third, I showed that the explanatory advantage of monotheism further lends itself to reasonable minds. For these reasons, rational, inquiring minds should believe in God. Thank you.
Affirmative number 2. You may begin.
Good afternoon. I have come here to argue for the existence of God on the basis of reason alone, without appealing to faith or to Scripture or emotion or personal experience. I have no interest in any of these things. I agree with David Hume that one should adjust one's beliefs to the evidence. So, as evidence, I will present 5 arguments for the existence of God, and I will use the term non-theist to include atheists, anti-theists, and agnostics. The first argument begins with the fact that many non-theists have moral knowledge and act on that knowledge in order to live morally good lives. But this is only possible if there exists an objectively binding moral law, which is neither arbitrary nor conventional. In other words, ethics is more than effective means of human interaction and more than efficient means of producing happiness. When someone says it is wrong to torture children for fun, they are appealing to an independent and objective moral standard. Now, there are 2 questions that we can ask here. The first question is this: what are the grounds for this moral standard? I will not be asking that question. Rather, I will assume that there is an objective moral standard even if God does not exist, so that I can focus on a second question, namely, how is it that we have any knowledge of the objective moral standard? Now, on some accounts, our ancestors came down from the trees about 10 million years ago and began struggling for survival on the open savanna plains. Walking upright with a bipedal gait, they were able to cover more ground in their search for food and would have been able to see above tall grasses in order to avoid predators. So on the non-theistic view, the biological development of early hominids, such as Homo habilis, and the development of their cognitive capacities is guided only by blind material forces working through natural selection. However, the moral standard is a static, inert, immaterial thing that can have no causal bearing on the natural selection and development of our cognitive capacities, including our ability to apprehend abstract moral truths. Thus, it is unlikely, if not impossible, that evolutionary considerations alone account for our ability to apprehend the objective moral standard when construed along non-theistic lines. However, when the hypothesis of God's existence is joined to the evolutionary account of the development of our cognitive capacities, there is no such difficulty. Since the evolution of our ability to apprehend objective moral truth is surprising on non-theism and unsurprising on theism, our possession of moral knowledge more strongly confirms theism than it does non-theism. While anyone can see that not torturing children can assist in the survival of one's species, that fact is not enough to explain how we know that it is objectively wrong to do such a thing. Belief in the existence of God is entirely rational on these considerations. Our second argument for God's existence, according to it, science testifies to the fact that we in some ways understand the world in which we are living. Reality is in part intelligible. In the end, there are only 2 kinds of philosophies: those that find the world ultimately intelligible and those that do not. The first view says that there is no intelligence behind the laws we apprehend in the universe. Rather, everything sprang forth from a primordial chaos. Slowly and without purpose, order took hold here and there in the chaos, and beings like ourselves emerged with the ability to understand those so-called pockets of intelligible nature. On this order out of chaos view, it is an astonishing accident that our minds comprehend nature in any way at all, and intelligibility is at best an inexplicable anomaly. and perhaps even an illusion. The competing view says that chaos is not fundamental to reality, but that mind is the most fundamental element of reality. This eternal reason hypothesis leads one to expect that there should be minds in the universe that can, in part, understand that universe. We believe that scientific laws that apply in certain cases will apply in all cases of that sort. But why do we believe that? Science itself cannot account for our trust in the intelligibility of nature or the reliability of scientific laws. But the fact that reality is intelligible is natural and fitting within the context of theism. It follows from this that there is good reason to believe that God exists. Our third argument for God's existence is based on our subjective experience of beauty in the natural world. While beauty as an experience is in the eye of the beholder, the experience of beauty is brought about reliably in us by objective features in the universe. This argument is straightforward. First, if nature is rooted in forces that are indifferent to values pertaining to beauty, then nature is no more likely to be seen as beautiful than are the works of humans when those works are made without artistic intent. Second, it is an empirical fact that nature is seen to be extensively shot through with beauty, whereas the products of human beings are rarely seen as beautiful when those are made without artistic intent. Therefore, we should conclude that nature probably does not originate in forces that are indifferent to the experience of beauty as non-theism maintains, but that nature is likely to be the work of a mind, and particularly of a mind attuned to the value of beauty. In short, the perception of beauty in the natural world gives us good reason to think that God exists. According to the fourth argument for God's existence, if one thinks carefully, one can see that the concept of God is the concept of the greatest conceivable being. That is, an unsurpassable being. And this is just as necessary as saying that triangles have 3 sides. Moreover, there are independent grounds for believing that it is greater for something to exist than not exist. That is, existence surpasses non-existence. It follows deductively from these 2 premises that God exists. All of the major objections to this argument fail. I have studied them all. They are all fallacious. According to the fifth argument, our best scientific theory for the origin of the universe is the standard model of Big Bang cosmology. On this model, matter, space, and time came into existence about 13.7 billion years ago. So whatever brought the universe into existence must be, by the nature of the case, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and immeasurably powerful. Theism holds that the universe is in some way dependent on God. Even if a coherent naturalistic alternative could be constructed to explain the Big Bang, it would be no more rational to believe than theism, given our current evidence. Therefore, this argument provides evidence for theistic belief. In conclusion, I have easily discharged my burden of proof with these 5 arguments for God's existence, and if time permitted, other arguments could be given. So it is reason that supports belief in God's existence, and it is to reason and reason alone that we should give our consent. Thank you very much.
Okay, opening statements for the negative. You may begin.
The first thing we need to do in addressing the God question is to look at the historical trend in discovered knowledge. History is rife with failed examples of where God was posited as the explanation for something and then failed. For instance, lightning was once thought to be the hand of an angry God, but was later found to be the result of mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects. Disease was once, in the absence of a natural explanation, thought to be the result of demons, but we now know that it's just microorganisms. Likewise, the order of the solar system was once thought to be produced by God's hand, but now we know it's simply gravity and what happens when gravity acts on objects with mass. And these are all testable predictions. They're testing what the world should look like if God doesn't exist versus what it would look like if he did. And we soon start to realize when we start playing these things out that God has no predictive power. You can't start from if God and predict something and go and see anything that doesn't look like a godless universe. And you can actually test this for yourselves. Try for just a minute to think of some question for which we once had a religious answer, but for which we now have a scientific answer. I mean, this should just be impossible for you. Or next, try to think of a proposition for which we once had a scientific answer, for which we now have a religious answer. This is the one that should be hard. The first one's as easy as geocentrism. But this establishes just what a one-way destruction the explanation of how the world works has been to all ideas of God's existence, which is what we would expect to see if naturalism was all there is out there. There literally was a time when nothing was explained, and ever since that time, quite literally everything we have explained has been found to be natural forces acting upon inanimate objects. So even for things we haven't explained, such as the question, from whence comes the universe, a wise person needs to look at the historical trend in discovered explanation. To reduce this to a metaphor, imagine you've got two boxers who have fought millions of fights. One of those boxers has won every single fight ever, and they're about to fight again. Who do you bet on? It's obvious you bet on the one that has continually won. Which brings me to my next point. Science is not finding God. It's finding a lot of things. It's finding out how big the universe is, how old the universe is. It's giving us microphones, bottled water, plentiful food, medicine. It's doing all this stuff, but it's not finding God. And one of the reasons for this is the universe does not look designed at all. The counter you'll hear to that is, but look at everything. It's so ordered. It's so complex. But the universe creates order and complexity all by itself. Take snowflakes, for example. They're far more complex than liquid water, each of them unique, but nobody feels the need to invoke a snowflake-making God because we know the natural processes that create that order all by themselves. This can even be said of the stars. All you need is a big cloud of hydrogen, big enough to accumulate enough mass to kickstart gravity. It'll collapse, and you'll get a much more complex star out of this cloud of not complex hydrogen. All you need is natural forces acting on inanimate objects. No appeal to God is necessary at all. So pointing to complexity does not rescue the God hypothesis. Atheism predicts a universe in which order is created all by itself, just through natural order. Theism, or the existence of a God, predicts the universe will be finding God as an explanation for anything. And to take it further, there are flaws in design. And not just like complex flaws that are simple enough for human beings to perceive, which makes no sense if something far more clever than we designed anything. Some examples. The appendix creates a scant amount of white blood cells, which we don't need. You could have your appendix removed. You'd never miss it. But for a lot of people, it's a ticking time bomb that can explode and cause a lot of pain. This is either malicious or downright incompetent. Another example is your eye. Your eyes have a blind spot. This is a mistake that even a freshman engineering student should be failed for. Your eye compensates by jiggling. This makes perfect sense if we evolved through natural means, but no sense whatsoever if God had a hand in anything. Another example is DNA. DNA replication is clunky and flawed. It creates all kinds of conditions like Down syndrome and even cancer, which is a result of a flaw in DNA replication. Once more, we can perceive this. Why didn't a God? To take it even further, the universe does not appear designed for life. 99.9999999% of the universe is absolutely lethal to life. If you were to take this hall as representative of the universe and take all the space where life could possibly exist, it would be a speck so microscopic none of you could ever find it with literally every instrument human beings have. But nobody would conclude then that this hall was designed for life. Now, On atheism, the only way we could exist is naturally. Atheism predicts that life is extremely improbable due to the fact that a self-replicating molecule would have to arise by accident. It entails that the only universe we could find ourselves in is the one we see. Because take something that's very improbable, like winning the lottery. Right? Let's say it's a 1 in a million chance. Yet people win the lottery all the time. Why? Because a million people are buying lottery tickets. If a million people buy lottery tickets, you should expect someone to win. If 5 million people buy lottery tickets, you should expect 5 people to win, even though it's largely improbable. So for atheism to be true, we should expect to find ourselves in a huge universe full of lots of stuff with lots of lottery tickets being purchased. This is, of course, the universe we find ourselves in. But God can make any type of universe he wishes. So the vast amounts of stuff is only needed if God didn't make life. Because if he didn't, it's random, and therefore improbable, and therefore life could only occur in a vastly large, vastly old universe filled with vast amounts of stuff, which happens to be where we find ourselves. But God doesn't need any of that unless he's designing the universe specifically to look like a universe with no God in it. Also, as they pointed out, our universe had a beginning. Nobody informed of the facts can deny this. The Big Bang cosmology. However, how can a bodiless mind exist and accomplish anything in a place where there was no time for them to accomplish it in, no space for them to accomplish it in? And what's more, minds as we know them exist only as machinery powered by tissues. And these tissues are made up of elements that were created in stars over time, the heavier elements. How could minds exist before the creation of those elements? How could a mind exist before stars? If our opposing team has evidence for how a bodiless mind can exist, they would need to present it to overcome that hurdle. And if thought does not require a functional brain, why do we have them? Your brain is this huge resource-hungry hog that makes your head huge and uses up most of the material we ingest. It's also the reason that without modern medicine, we kill our mothers during childbirth a lot of the time. In fact, there are actually hominid species before us that killed off their whole species because their brains were too big and their mothers died too often. That's crappy design, to say the least. My next argument is the argument from suffering or argument from divine inaction. If God is evil, it would not allow us happiness. But we can be happy. I'm happy right now. A benevolent God would not allow us suffering, but we can suffer. An indifferent God, a pitiless God, looks exactly like a universe with no God, and Occam's razor cuts it right out. There is no moral agent in the room. For instance, one of the stories that gets brought up on this a lot is the story of some parents who were cooking dinner, and their child was running around, reached up and grabbed a piece of the meat and ate it. And they rushed him to the hospital, and a couple hours later, he died of E. coli poisoning. Now, any of us in that room would have done something if we had seen it. We would have moved the meat. We would have told him not to eat it. So would the parents. But they have the limitation of not being able to see their kid all the time or pay attention to everything. But God doesn't have those limitations. If there's a moral agent in the room that is at least as compassionate as we, and I hope God would be at least as compassionate as we, it would have done something. But atheism predicts there is no moral agent in the room, and that's exactly what we see. The last argument I have is the argument from divine silence. All God needs to do is come talk to me. I have questions. I have Tuna Helper in my house. He could swing by. And my friends who care about me and want me to believe something actually come and talk to me, but God doesn't do this. God would not be giving people contradictory messages and experiences of the divine, which is exactly what we're seeing. Compassion would compel God to give us the best chance at salvation, not the worst, or at least the best chance of knowing the truth about the universe. This results in tons of man-made religions, which is exactly what atheism predicts. In a universe with a God, we would all have some agreement on who God is, what his will is, but we don't. The universe doesn't look like it was like the universe predicted by the God hypothesis at all. It looks exactly the opposite. It looks exactly the way we would expect it to be if atheism were true. We don't need God to explain the universe, therefore atheism's true. Rock.
Opening negative statement number 2. You may begin.
So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I'm honored to be invited to do this alongside JT. And I too am eager for debates and discussions to happen. I find it curious, and part of the reason for that is that this is a conversation that, as far as we can tell, humankind has been having since we've been able to have conversations. It's a debate that's raged, as far as we can tell, for just about as long as we can tell. And yet, here we are having this debate again, which clearly means somebody hasn't met their burden of proof. But jokes aside, this really is something that I find curious, but it's also something I find important and significant. We live the vast majority of our lives relying on inference and induction to get by. The world today is pretty much the same as it was yesterday. Not a lot changes. This is really beneficial for us, and we have evolved brains that make use of the fact that very little changes to help us make predictions and get through life, to help us make determinations about what's best for us. It can be evidenced in simple examples like, throwing and catching a ball. The laws of physics don't tend to change enough, at least within the thin view that we have, to make this a vastly unpredictable enterprise. The problem is that we're really, really, really good at this. We're so good at inference and induction. We're so good on relying on our visceral intuitions about the universe because they are so often reliable in the grand scheme that it builds a false confidence in our ability to actually think and use deductive reasoning. It builds an arrogance in our own intellectual capacity. We pay lip service to the fact we don't know everything. It's one of my favorite things that saying I don't know is the best answer you can give until you actually have a real answer. And we pay lip service to that, but everybody in this room and everybody on the planet, no matter how hard they try, fails. We're know-it-alls, every one of us. That's a problem, and it's a problem because in this long-term debate and discussion that we've had about God's existing, by the way, I doubt you're going to hear anything that's particularly new tonight. We've been having these debates and discussions so long, the arguments even have names. The moral argument, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, teleological argument, the anthropic principle, etc. And we've seen some of them cited. We'll probably hear more cited. Appeals to Occam's razors. I'm not the only one. I'm glad I'm not the only one who'll be citing Hume tonight, which means we have probably lots of common ground. But what's happened is our intuitions have trained our brains so that we're really, really good at finding a way to take bad arguments and hide the flaws. And so the past arguments that, like for example, the ontological argument, has fallen out of favor. Alvin Pantego came up with a modalogic version of it, and we've heard some of that tonight as well. But we're good at that. We're good at hiding the flaws. We're good at deceiving ourselves. If you expected one side to show up here and present all kinds of hardcore evidence for the existence of God and the other side to show up with all sorts of evidence that there are no gods, you came to the wrong place. In reality, my view of this, and we've heard it phrased as positive and negative atheism, is that this is much more like a courtroom where there is a burden of proof, there is a base presumption. You've heard the reference to presumptive atheism. And we're here to roughly establish guilty or not guilty, not necessarily to demonstrate innocence. Although that's a case that I'm willing to take up off hours, the case that in fact there are no gods. But when we look at these court cases, for example, how many people in this room believe that extraterrestrials are visiting Earth, abducting our citizens, and taking them away for medical experiments? That's what I thought. Now, why don't you believe this? Are you not aware that you can actually go and interview living, breathing people who will give you their firsthand account? This isn't hearsay. This isn't I saw this. This is what I actually experienced. And if experiential evidence alone, direct experience, was enough to be rationally justified, clearly these people must be. They will tell you their experiences. You can talk to many of them, different people who have not interacted in any way that we can tell, and their stories will be very similar. So, we've got the little gray aliens with the big eyes and everything. You can talk to groups of people who will claim to have either been abducted or abducted by the same aliens or abducted at the same time, or just have seen UFOs and seen people be abducted, etc. What do we make of this? Why is it that most people don't believe that? Are we not aware that there's things like the Drake equation that attempt to calculate the probability that life on Earth, how probable it is that life on Earth is the only life in the universe? And the answer is, oh my gosh, it's so absurd to think and arrogant to think that this is the only place that life formed. So clearly, we have lots of good reasons to potentially think that there are aliens who might be visiting and abducting people. And yet we don't, by and large. Normally those people often are kind of shunned, hopefully not too meanly. And so if you'll forgive me for actually addressing something about Christianity in particular, I'm not doing it to address the religion, but C.S. Lewis has famously said that what you think about Jesus is the only thing that really matters. And he presented it in his famous trilemma that the only options are liar, lunatic, and Lord. And I not so humbly submit that C.S. Lewis was arrogant. That there's a fourth option that starts with an L, which is legend, which we heard a little bit about from David Fitzgerald today. And there are possibly many, many more. So when we look at these alien abduction scenarios, are these people delusional? Are they deceived? Are they attempting to deceive us? Are they dead right? Are they dead wrong? How many D's can we come up with? And the arrogance is assuming that we have the capacity and the knowledge at present to consider all of the options. This when you've eliminated everything that's probable, whatever's left, however impossible, it must be the answer, is wrong, because you can't achieve that. You can't eliminate that. Every argument, and I don't want to, especially sitting here with a couple of professors of logic, a logical syllogism you can look at as having two characteristics, validity and soundness, and validity goes to structure. And a logically valid syllogism is one where true premises necessarily lead to a true conclusion. Soundness is the determination of whether or not the premises are actually true. Our dependence on inference and induction have led us to make all sorts of assumptions where when we're not able to figure out and spot the flaw, we go ahead and accept the premise. That's not the rational course of action. The rational course of action is that every premise should be rejected until such time as it's demonstrated to be true. In court cases, there's a number of different standards of evidence. In some cases, you need to demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt. In other court cases, you may have to demonstrate to a preponderance of the evidence. And these are different standards of evidence for different claims. And Carl Sagan has famously reminded us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I submit that the claim that a God exists is, as far as I can tell, far more extraordinary than whether or not aliens exist and are potentially abducting our citizens. It's more extraordinary than whether or not JT murdered somebody and is on trial for it. It's not enough to actually just claim it. It's not enough to present arguments. And even as in a court case, the defense doesn't have to call a single witness or make a single argument. It may seem very, very unfair, and people can rail against it till they're blue in the face. The only thing they have to do is make the case that the other side hasn't made the case. We're in pretty much the same position here. I don't have to defend the claim there are no gods, just as I don't have to defend the claim JT is innocent. I may be able to present evidence that could lead some people to that conclusion. And there are atheists who are in the not guilty category, who don't believe a God exists, but they're not convinced. You can believe things to different degrees of certainty, short of absolute certainty with a couple of exceptions. You can believe things for good reasons and for bad reasons. The goal, though, is to believe things for good reasons and to try to make our internal model of the universe mesh as best as possible with the external universe. We have tools to do that. Critical thinking, logical thought, reason, and scientific evidence. An argument on its own can never achieve that.
What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking a 10-minute break for you, but what the participants will be doing is doing a strategy session. So technically the debate is still ongoing. So if I could ask you to keep silent as much as you possibly can, feel free to go to the bathroom, to get a drink, to look at the tables outside with the things they brought to sell. But if you could keep it to a very quiet session for the 10 minutes for our participants to actually strategize. Thank you. The audience will please gather to their seats. We'll open up to our second half of the debate for our rebuttals. We'll begin with the affirmative. Both affirmatives will be 5 minutes apiece. You may begin.
My opponents pointed out the rationality of the universe and that science supposedly has the steamroller effect on all of the religious claims throughout history. I would like to point out that theism postulates that the universe is indeed rational, that our senses are reliable, that natural law is going to explain the vast majority, 99.9% of things, and what the non-theist might claim is an anomaly or is just yet to be explained by science. Some of those, the theists can postulate, could be miracles. But bear in mind that a great deal of science owes gratitude to its forebears, the belief in a rational universe, the intensely personal conceiving of different elements of the universe as revealing the mind of God, similar to perhaps a love letter of your spouse. If I were to read a love letter, I could perhaps describe the lines, the squiggles, and talk about the relation of ink and paper, and I could come to a great deal of knowledge. But knowing that there's a person behind it has uniquely inspired the sciences in the Western world, because science didn't emerge in India and in China. What did emerge of it was not much compared to Renaissance and Enlightenment era. But it was the belief in a personal God, which is precisely what Sloan and I have suggested is a fair hypothesis, given that billions of people already agree. Now, what evidence equally is expected by both sides is not evidence against either. And the regularity of nature does not disconfirm theism in the slightest. It's actually anticipated and predicted. Also, skepticism has the curious challenge or curious oddity about it that it is very easy to question. Anybody can question, anybody can doubt, but I would postulate that doubt itself deserves to be justified. Doubt can be very lazy. Doubt can be a corner-cutting effort to prevent having to really think through complicated issues. Now, I'm all for doubt. I think there's excellent ways to use doubt to come to knowledge, but I do not for a second ground the default presumptive atheist, the intellectual high ground, as having no burden of proof. Now, it is true that presumptive atheism takes a position that is making no claim about reality. I grant that. But there's an implicit counterclaim that their presumptive atheism is rational. Now that gives you one of three options. It could indeed be rational, it could be irrational, or it could be non-rational. And frankly, I don't believe either of my opponents are content to say it's totally non-rational or that it's irrational. But if it is to be rational, then that doubt must be justified. And I gave 10 lines of evidence, which from what I can tell weren't really addressed as such. Because like I said, the vast majority of nature we expect to be patterned in keeping with a rational God. Plus the idea that science makes God superfluous, I don't grant this at all, because the fact of mind as we know it deserves an explanation. And from what we know, non-mind has never been shown to be able to produce mind. Non-moral is of nature has never been shown to be able to produce the oughts of moral thought. As far as the bad design element goes that my opponents brought up, bad design, as long as there's even one element of design in the universe, that's sufficient to show that there is a God. Remember that theism is remarkably adaptable. Theism can affirm a God who's limited in power and perhaps evil, a la Rabbi Harold Kushner. Theism can correspond to a flawed scripture, a la Karl Barth. Theism corresponds to the imperfection and what theologically is called the fallenness of the universe, a la Genesis 3 and on. Also, the idea that theism is a science stopper, I would suggest that atheistic naturalism has just as much capacity to stop science. And my key example is junk DNA, expecting that we would find a bunch of junk that is superfluous add-on throughout the centuries of evolution and the millennia of evolution. Many people concluded that this extra stuff that doesn't code for protein must be junk. And only recently are we coming to the conclusion that there's a tremendous amount of information happening at the DNA level that explains how we get to what we have in life.
Okay, the second affirmative rebuttal. You may begin.
All right, there's way more that I would like to address than what I have time to address and what our opponents have spoken to this afternoon. So I'm just going to try to hit a couple of the highlights, and hopefully some of the other issues will come up during the question and answer session. First, let me review my arguments. What specifically did our opponents say about any of my particular arguments? My first argument, the evolutionary argument for morality. Well, Mr. Dillahunty said it had a name. It was called the moral argument, but then moved on. Well, I call it the evolutionary moral argument. And I haven't heard anyone else present it. I developed it myself, so I think it's original. And I don't think that saying an argument isn't original is really a critique of that argument. So even if my argument wasn't original, so what? The argument from our perception of order in nature, Mr. Eberhard spoke about cancer and as an example of a dysteleology, bad design. We don't need a snowflake designer. I didn't appeal to God as as an explanation for any particular instance of order that we see in the universe. My argument from the perception of order in nature appealed to the fact that we perceive order in nature generally. They didn't speak to that issue. My argument from beauty, nothing at all was said in response to that. My ontological argument, again, just an observation that we've spoken about. Other people have talked about it. It's not really an objection. And the argument against Big Bang cosmology, Mr. Eberhard admitted that the first premise of the argument is true, that the universe began to exist. So he granted a premise of the argument, but didn't specifically object to it. They did make general observations. How am I doing on time?
2:48.
Okay. They did make some general observations I'd like to hit. God isn't really an explanation, seemed to be one of the things that was said by Mr. Eberhard. Well, if you only accept mechanistic explanations, then God isn't going to be an explanation for anything. But that's the fallacy of begging the question, and I don't see any reason why I should beg the question here. There was this idea of that there's that Mr. Dillahunty brought up. He said we are sometimes arrogant in our ability to use logic and reason, that we hide our flaws, fall prey to instances of confirmation bias. I didn't show up here to try to confirm my biases. I came here to hear arguments on both sides of the issue, to present arguments on one side of the issue, and hear arguments on the other side of the issue. He said, Mr. Dillahunty says we should never accept a premise until it's demonstrated. This seems to me to be demonstrably false. There are self-evident truths that are incapable of demonstration, but it would be patently irrational for anyone to reject them. Premises of this sort, self-evident premises and premises of necessary truths that employ necessary truths. He says that that the existence of God is an extraordinary claim, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I would like to know on what grounds does he think that the existence of God is an extraordinary claim? Generic theism, how is that extraordinary? Does he have a sample size that he's found it to be rare that theism is true? I'd like to know more about that. In fact, many rare things can be very plausible. Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants only once, but it's still plausible that he did it given our evidence. He compares the existence my case to the testimony of others being abducted by extraterrestrials. I didn't make any appeals to personal experience. Their experiences are what they are. I would like to have more than just their testimony as to being abducted by aliens. I don't have that. That's why I don't believe in alien abduction. But I have more than mere testimonial experience for theism. So he's committed the fallacy of faulty analogy here. There are other issues that I'd like to get to, but I'm simply out of time. Thank you.
Move to the negative rebuttal. You may begin.
Both Ferrer and Sloan said similar things. Ferrer said, my 10 lines weren't addressed. That's because it was the opening round and not the rebuttal. The rebuttal round is this round. Sloan...
pardon me, I'll stop the time. The audience will refrain from applauding because it only takes away from the speaker's time.
I agreed. Sloan said that Matt compared his argument to existence from aliens and didn't address X, Y, and Z. That's because it was the opening round, not the rebuttal, which is now. Okay, on to rebuttal. All right, for his presumptive atheism, his 10 lines of evidence presumes that experiences are not evidence. They are evidence, they're just very bad evidence. If God existed, personal experience should corroborate with everybody else. But if one religious sect's religious experience is right, usually all the others have to be false, especially with monotheism. So even individuals, say Christians or Muslims, must admit that the starting probability of someone being completely deluded about their religious experience must be much higher than any genuine religious experience for them to be right. What's keeping us from saying they're all similarly deluded due to some fault in psychology? I said so many people agree on a God. No, they don't. There's so many different competitive ideas of God. It's more like people making up their own gods and then having them clash. That is far more likely. We can't tell other people if they haven't had a religious experience. I think they're genuine, but we can certainly say you're probably wrong. Go back to the argument about starting probability of religious experience. He said we presume miracles aren't true, but every attestament to miracles, they generally seem to be culturally determined. And what are the odds that the laws of nature have been somehow suspended in your favor, or that you are somehow wrong? Naturalism has to be the presumption there. He said we're hardwired to believe in God. And he said the evidence for this is that we're hardwired to see order. Well, yes, we see order. This is the evolution of the brain. All we need is a universe in which distinctions exist and the ability to perceive them. It's a survival mechanism. We may be designed to, not designed, certainly. We may be hardwired to infer design, but there are many cognitive failures in our brain that Matt touched on in his opening that it would be far more likely such phenomena as pareidolia or something like that would better explain the fact that we infer design from order. He cited we reject apparent design, but he didn't provide an example of apparent design for me to refute. I see. He said we presume the origin of the universe was natural. There are many models that take care of this. Small and multiverse theory is one of them. Another one, when we've determined that the ratio of subatomic particles that came out of the Big Bang are the exact same number of exact same ratio of subatomic particles that occur when we smash atoms together in particle colliders. This leads physicists to believe that Big Bangs are inevitably what happens when you smash enough matter under enough pressure. So if this were happening in black holes, it would be opening up into other pockets of space-time, creating a multiverse system like that. And we have scientific evidence for this. I just listed off some of it. So that would be an instance where we could have a universe that would have a completely natural origin that would precede our own, or even extend back infinitely. And if you don't think that's the case. Take it up with physicists. We presume there is not enough evidence, he says. Well, that's because we haven't had enough provided. You could fix that. Any religious person could fix that. And we presume that a lot of things aren't compatible with God. Or he says that God is compatible with evolution, naturalism. Well, so is anything. I could say Smurfs were behind evolution. It's compatible, but compatibility is not the arbiter of truth. Okay. The ontological argument. He says he studied it and all refutations fail, so I guess we're just hosed there. No. A perfect God exists, and a perfect God definitionally exists. So does a perfect nothing. A perfect nothing could exist, or a perfect nothing is conceivable, and would, by definition, exist. See, that would take care of Sloan's Big Bang. Let me hit first cause real quick. Whatever started existence either had to have existed forever and been doing things forever, or been uncaused. It's one of those two. If you say it existed forever, why not just matter and the laws of physics, these things that create order all by themselves? God seems like a superfluous variable. And if it was an uncaused cause, why does it have to be a God? Why can't we just say, I don't know? At the quantum level, things happen without cause all the time. This is why we have a whole field of study in probability fields. Once again, take it up with physicists. But the beginning of our universe would have occurred on that level. There's a lot we don't know about, but just because we don't know doesn't mean they do. Thank you.
The second negative rebuttal, you may begin.
I sense a theme of nearly running out of time. On the morality issue, unfortunately, I've been running around and having actual entire debates on that subject, so let me condense it as quickly as I can. I see no reason that it's not entirely possible to begin with very, very simple things, including fire, hot, bad, and have this evolve as we learn more into morality. We need nothing more to begin with than our own self-preservation. You can challenge whether or not self-preservation is something that we should value, and I'd say that those who didn't value aren't here. They're gone. We are the product of millions of years of evolution, of learning more and more about the world that we live in, what benefits us, what harms us. We're far from having everything perfect. If you imagine, for any given scenario, there are a finite number of possible actions that one can take. They're not all the same, which means there's differences. We contrast those differences and try to determine which ones are more beneficial to us, which ones are more beneficial to our group. Yes, we have a selective preference for our own species. I'm a proud speciesist, or at least I'm not embarrassed about it. And we figure out which ones are harmful. Now, you can have this scale where you're constantly trying to figure out what are the best possible outcomes. Those represent objective moral absolutes, objective in the sense that they're not contingent upon any one person. I'm not a moral relativist. I've railed against moral relativists for years. The idea that, oh, my culture says it's okay, so it's okay, is nonsense. On the subject that reality is intelligible, one of the options that Sloan gave was that there's no intelligence behind the laws of the universe. Yep, I accept that. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. It's because the laws of the universe are descriptive and not proscriptive. They're not laws like the Constitution that required an author. They are a description of the physical properties of the universe. There is no reason to even presume that they needed some author or some governor. On the question of whether or not why I find the question of God extraordinary, have I found it rare? Yeah, I've found it incredibly rare. I have yet to find a single example that I find reliable that demonstrates that a God actually exists, despite continued appeals to people to provide the evidence, and I was a fundamentalist Christian for 25 years, and many appeals on my own to God and then to other gods to present themselves or do something of that kind. I know that's not what we're talking about, but yes, I do find it an extraordinary claim. It ties in with something that John had said about his claim that the natural world plus the supernatural world is always going to be a better answer. Well, sure, it's magic. Magic solves everything. But until you demonstrate that anything supernatural has ever occurred, you cannot assert that it's a better explanation. In fact, it may detract from you finding an actual explanation, something that John seems to think that atheism is guilty of. His example of junk DNA, saying that, oh, we found this junk DNA. Well, guess what, John? It didn't halt science. Science kept going, and science found the flaws in those assumptions. So you're fear-mongering about the end of science as a result of scientists finding junk DNA is one that I just don't understand. But John said a couple of other things. One was that this idea of intelligence and reasoning and ability deserves an explanation. Those are his words. This is the appeal of religious claims and the appeal of claims about gods. Boy, it's really cool to have certainty. It's really cool to no longer have any questions and not be forced to say, I don't know. Sometimes when you say, I don't know, that's how you get to actually knowing. And those who assert that they know before it's justified are the ones that are halting this progress. There's an implicit claim that doubt, one of the options is that doubt is rational. I have a difficult time, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can even put this into words in a minute. I have a difficult time finding any way of viewing doubt as anything other than eminently irrational. Going back to the court case, if we have come, it's not always the case that you presume innocent until we've determined guilt. Not all court systems use that, and all in history use that. We've come to that understanding. We've come to the understanding that that is the best way. And we know that the universe is intelligible because it continually demonstrates it. Nobody was ever required to have a pre-existing belief in a God in order to work on the assumption that the universe is intelligible. And we were able to test this and find that, by and large, the universe is intelligible. That's how we know.
Okay, we'll move to closing statements, 5 minutes for each participant. You may begin.
Thank you for those comments. I'll try to respond to them quickly. You mentioned with respect to, Mr. Eberhard mentioned with respect to the perception of order, that the brain was evolved to perceive order. I grant the force of this to the degree that the perception of order in cases which further our survival, for example, the perception of order within vegetation that can provide us food or shelter or safety, that these are the kinds of order that we would expect to evolve. But that's a far cry from perceiving order in the periodic table or in stellar spectral analysis. And that far outstrips what it seems that Darwinian processes can explain there. He appealed to Lee Smolin's multiverse theory or fecund universe theory as in a way to rebut the Big Bang argument for God's existence. The problem with Lee Smolin's multiverse theory is that it predicts that there should be no neutron star with 1.6 times the mass of the sun, but in 2010 such a star was in fact discovered, falsifying Lee Smolin's, empirically falsifying Lee Smolin's multiverse theory. He says the God seems superfluous. It's okay to say, I don't know. Well, I've attempted to give arguments today that show that an appeal to God is not superfluous. He says that he describes the ontological argument as the claim that God is perfect. The way I formulated the ontological argument did not appeal to perfection. I followed Anselm, who said that God is that than which nothing greater could be conceived. But nowhere in Anselm's Proslogion does he claim that God is perfect. So that is the straw man fallacy with respect to that argument. How am I doing on time?
2:33.
Okay. Mr. Dillahunty, on the issue of morality says that it's possible to start with observation, the fire is hot, and then eventually develop to the place that we have morality. Well, the problem with this is that is descriptive, not prescriptive. And if we start with prescriptive language, that's all we'll ever have. One doesn't start with prescriptive language and then somehow end up with prescriptive language. He says that he believes in objective moral absolutes. Yes, that's the first premise of my evolutionary moral argument. I'm glad to see that he grants it. He says that there's no intelligence behind the laws of nature. Well, maybe there's not, but it seems to me that if mind is fundamental to reality, then we should have a prior expectation that we should find nature at least to be in part intelligible, and that's precisely what we do, in fact, find. He says that belief in God is extraordinary. I haven't experienced God, he says, therefore it's extraordinary. Well, there's lots of things I haven't experienced. It doesn't follow from that fact alone that those things are and somehow inherently extraordinary. I need to see more of an argument to undergird that claim. He says that supernatural explanations have never been found, so you shouldn't appeal to supernatural explanations. Well, if we're barred from ever appealing to supernatural explanations, then guess what? We'll never find any. It's nice circular question begging. He says it's okay not to be certain. It's cool if we are certain, but it's okay if we're not. We're often not certain. We often don't know. I never claimed that any of these arguments provided us with certainty for the existence of God. All I did was claim that these arguments, the arguments that I presented, make it more likely that theism is true than non-theism. I didn't claim certainty with respect to any of those issues. How am I doing on time?
5 seconds.
I'm done then. Thank you.
The second affirmative closing, you may begin.
JT made the point that experience is bad evidence. I would postulate that for the individual, experience can be profoundly powerful evidence. While I grant that, generally speaking, if one person has an experience and no one else has it, then that's not very compelling to those other people that did not have that firsthand experience. But when you multiply that billions of times over, one has to wonder, am I missing something? If there is wide agreement that nature is not the full extent of all there is, then when someone is willing to presume the starting probability against religious experience, I'm not sure how one would understand that, since I already pointed out that theism, at least in most of its conventional forms, postulates that 99.9% of the world will operate in perfectly normal, rational, discernible ways. And I would also affirm that theism actually allows for this in a way superior to atheism, given that theism says mind produce mind. We don't know any way that non-mind could ever produce mind. We have explanation, but we have no demonstration. And that's what it really takes before a person can don that lab coat and carry the authority of science, saying science says. And since there's no demonstration of that sort and very poor philosophy to try to cover up those gaps, I would say that theism anticipates that we could have minds to discern a rational order, and thus justifying the inference and evidential-based arguments that we're doing here today. That makes much more sense given the fact of mind. Also, there's wide agreement on God, even if there's disagreement on the particularities of that character. Let's see, my opponents also granted that there is hardwiring, that we are hardwired to believe in God. I would also reiterate my point that really wasn't addressed at all, that if we're hardwired to believe in God and we're hardwired to draw inferences about the world, to trust our senses as basically reliable, generally reliable, if we're going to treat it with an a priori skepticism, then what we end up with is not atheism strictly speaking, as it's commonly experienced today. But what we end up with is if we apply skepticism at that fundamental level, we end up with Nietzschean nihilism. We don't end up with the more happy-go-lucky, positive forms of atheism today. Not positive atheism, but negative atheism, strictly speaking. Also, as far as the first cause goes, we're not arguing from ignorance. We're not saying magic did it. That is a straw man and a hasty generalization. We postulate that there's a rational order behind this universe which justifies the rationality we find in the universe. And so we argue by a form of analogy that we know what intelligence is because we have some, and we infer an intelligence that's different than ours in some important respect, namely that it can do things at a time when we didn't exist to do them. Also, again, the first cause argument, naturalistic attempts at that tend to fail miserably. Sloan pointed out Smolin's hypothesis, but we can also say that theories that postulate an expanding and contracting universe has the same problem a bouncing basketball has, in that the bounces get smaller and smaller till nothing, and if it's winding down, then it needed to have been wound up, and if it had been wound up in the first place, something had to set it off. And that is the natural inference of the first cause. That is exactly why Albert Einstein was very discontent with coming to the full conclusions of his theory of relativity, because he realized that his steady state theory was not compatible with the evidence he was discovering. And bear in mind that he thought his form of belief about God was probably more akin to pantheism, which is a defeater to atheism. And then, I don't know what caused the universe. That was proposed. I grant that we don't know everything, but I am prepared to say we can draw reasonable inferences about some things, such as the first cause. And frankly, I'm just not content with ignorance. I think the spirit of science tells us to push that inquiry deeper and ask, are the natural causes the only causes? And even if you prove something 99.9% correct, there's still that grounding or sufficient, such as what theism predicts about the universe and natural causes. There's still sufficient grounds for asking another question. As for Matt's fire, hot, bad, these guys have totally dropped the ball when it comes to the moral arguments, failing to show that knowledge and moral behavior can correspond to an ought in nature.
We'll move to the closing statements for the negative.
Okay, Sloan said that he sees how we could perceive, how naturalism could explain perceptions of order in little things, but not in the periodic chart like chemistry or physics. Why not? We use the exact same principles to determine the age of the universe as we do to determine how fast a rock falls. He didn't give a reason for that distinction. The problem with Smolin multiverse has been modified, and new theories replete with our newer understanding of the way the universe works exist. He also didn't provide any evidence against the black hole model I gave earlier. The ontological argument. He didn't say perfect God. He said being for which nothing can be greater. Greater is subjective. I might think the greatest jacket is this brown color, and you might think it's red. You know, what is greater in this case? I said there's no intelligence behind the laws. I don't even know what I was going with that. Okay. See. He said if we can't appeal to the supernatural, well, that's a circular argument. No, search for it. Search for supernatural. Experiments have designed searching for the supernatural, and they have all failed. Once more, this is what we would expect if atheism were true, not what we would expect if supernaturalism or God existed. Okay. Ferrer says the experience of a single person is bad evidence, and is not the best evidence. It's evidence, but not the best evidence. And he's right. He said, but when everything is agreed upon, but everything is not agreed upon, God has all these different characteristics. And at one point, everybody agreed the world was flat. You know, everybody agreeing on something doesn't necessarily make it true. In that particular case, the reason everybody agreed the world was flat is because what Matt was talking about, where we have these problems with our inductive reasoning. It's easy to induct the world is flat, but we need to apply reason and skepticism to try and figure out what is actually true, to get around the failures in our induction. Let's see. He says that God is compatible with 99.9% naturalism. Okay, so he says there's 0.1% that could be God. Provide some evidence. Don't just point out that that naturalism, or it's compatible with almost all of naturalism. You have to provide some evidence for that 0.1%. He says non-mind cannot produce a mind. Well, sure it can. What are computers? Computers are non-thinking materials arranged in a certain way so that they can perform logic functions and actually think. Well, that's all our brains are. Non-thinking matter arranged in a certain way so that we can think. And anytime you have a system in which you have reproduction, mutation, and selection over time, you're going to have increasingly more complex and functional things. This is the system that built our brains with no appeal to God being necessary. It makes perfect sense on evolution, none whatsoever on God. He said we're hardwired to infer design and says this is evidence for God. But why? Wouldn't it make sense if we were evolving to become more survivable in our environment that we would infer that we would be able to see order and infer design from what we do by ourselves with making tools and all the order we make? But that's simply not the case. Once more, with snowflakes, stars, order gets produced all by itself. So if we look at stars as we once did, or lightning as we once did, and said, oh, there's order, I infer design, once more, that's another flaw in our induction, another flaw in our cognition that we need to apply to science to get around our limits as thinkers. Rational order. The universe must have been wound up. Even if I concede that, which I don't, look up the work of Lawrence Krauss, probably the most brilliant living physicist. It completely refutes that. But even if I concede the universe must have been wound up, why does it have to be God? Remember, historical trend of discovered knowledge. Every time we've jumped the gun and said, well, here's this thing we don't know, it must be God, we found out later, whoop, nope, natural causes. Why take something we haven't explained, like even if we say the universe must be wound up, and posit God? It still makes no sense. And he closed by saying, I'm not content with ignorance. No one's asking him to be content with ignorance. I'm not content with ignorance. But I'm also not content with people pretending to know things they don't. That is the opposite of science. It's the opposite of rationality, and it's selling the potential of humanity incredibly short.
Okay, we'll move to 5-minute closing remarks. We'll begin with the affirmative.
No.
Oh, I am so sorry.
This is the last. We're about to end the 5-minute closing remarks.
Pardon me. One more negative rebuttal. Pardon me.
Oh, I'm not that negative.
You may begin.
So I may be a little different from some other people, so I will freely apologize to both of you if you don't get what you expect in the course of this, because once upon a time, I mentioned at the beginning that I thought that it was kind of curious that we were having this debate, and once upon a time it would have been curious to me for another reason, and that was that it would have never occurred to me to question that a God existed. It was just something that I believed. It was something I accepted. It was absurd to me. I mean, the notion would never occurred. I'm surrounded by other people who believe. You're in church and you feel what you think is the Holy Ghost, or what somebody tells you is the Holy Ghost type thing. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on my background here because it's not relevant to the debate. But that's the mindset that I would have been coming from. So there may be theists here who came to see the hard-hearted heathens get wiped all over the place and embarrassed, and there may be atheists here who were hoping that JT and I would leap across the table and throttle our opponents and bash their credulity. How dare you propose something preposterous? For the people who actually came here on a sincere quest dedicated for truth and an interest in the dialogues, those are the people that I most connect with. I don't pretend, I couldn't possibly pretend to know everything. There's a ton of physics questions that get directed at me where my eyes just glaze over and I pass along. But I mentioned at the beginning throughout history, they haven't actually met the burden of proof for establishing a God exists. And I know that they'd like us, to debate in such a way that we're asserting that no God exists. And maybe we can do that debate sometime. I don't assert that this is anything I can demonstrate to absolute certainty. But in my estimation, and I'm not claiming that this is truth or that it's truth for anybody else, the interesting thing about a court case is that first you have to demonstrate probable cause. Before you ever get to bother with wasting or spending your time establishing and meeting your burden of proof, you have to demonstrate probable cause before you can have a case. I think this is a debate that's been raging throughout the course of human history with nobody ever bothering to establish probable cause. Laplace, when he brought his book to Napoleon said, "Hey, you didn't include God in this," and Laplace was, and I'm paraphrasing obviously because it's French and stuff, but I had no need for that hypothesis. Hume is easily my favorite, so I was glad when Sloan brought him up earlier. And one of Hume's, there's two things that Hume said that will stick with me forever. And the first is reject the greater miracle. It's important that he phrased it that way because he doesn't say accept the lesser miracle, which I think is what too many people are willing to do, to accept the lesser miracle given the options they're presented. The other thing he says is that a wise man apportions his belief to the evidence, which is, I guess, a little sexist because he included man in there, but we'll let it slide considering the times. In this continuing search for truth, we've got the tools that we need and we have to use them. Critical thinking, reason. We're all in agreement, I think, on reason. We're just not necessarily all in agreement on standards of evidence, of what constitutes making the case. And one of the things that bugs me is that I don't find God as an explanation to have any explanatory power. This appeal of certainty or pretend certainty is neat. But we tend to explain things in terms of other things that we understand. You can't solve a mystery by appealing to a mystery. You can't solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery, for sure. And so, even if there was not a counter to the particular premise of an argument that you may have accepted, and you can feel comfortable in saying, yep, I accept the premises of that argument, so I'm going to accept the conclusion, and I'm going to keep on believing or keep on not believing, whatever the case may be. You could feel confident in that. But my concern isn't whether or not an idea is comforting, whether or not I'm confident in my understanding. It's about trying to improve my understanding as best I can to fit reality. Until such time as there's sufficient hard evidence that a God exists or that aliens are abducting people on this planet, belief simply isn't justified. And the time to believe it is 1 second after that evidence has been presented.
Okay, now we will move to the closing statements, beginning with the affirmative.
That was the closing statement.
That's what happens when time flies and you're having fun. Let's move.
I don't have a second closing statement. Did you bring a second closing?
What we're going to be doing today now is move towards our Q&A time. I'm going to get my timer set.
Would it be possible while you're setting up the Q&A for us to take a quick restroom break?
Yeah, let's go and do that. With it, y'all go ahead and move towards the restroom if you need to, but I'll describe to the audience how we will conduct our question and answer time. They're going to move the camera up here, and what we're going to do is I'm going to set up two lines. This will be a line for a question for the affirmative, for the adherents that believe, the participants believe that God does exist, and we're going to set up a line right here for a question for the negative, is what we'll do. I would like you to keep your questions quite concise if you can, and address it either to the affirmative or to the negative. I will alternate accordingly, unless there's no one in the line. And I will just keep going, and what they'll do is the affirmative or the negative will answer, and then we'll go to the next question. Know that you will not have a chance for a follow-up question. We won't be able to have that opportunity because we want to go through as many questions as we possibly can. Also, the participants realize that they will not be responding to their opponent's answers. We'll just move to the next question is what we'll be doing. How are we doing on the camera time? Okay, no problem. So as you formulate your questions, I'll give about 30 seconds or a minute for you to formulate your questions, and you can go ahead and stand on one of these lines. Again, this is for the affirmative, and this will be for the negative side.
If any of you out there ever thinking about buying a droid, don't. Droids? They can perform logical functions. Well, not droids, but iPhones maybe. And that's not the droid you're looking for. No, it's not. No droid is the droid you're looking for. Someone pick a foreign language.
French.
Ooh, everyone says French. I hate that language. Give me a different language. Okay, she said Italian, so I'm going to go Italian. Here, come here.
Okay.
Dead time when you're away.
We'll move to the question and answer format. We have 30 minutes for this. We'll begin with the affirmative side, starting now.
If you want to hear more, I might have to go to the restroom again in a couple of minutes.
The things I do.
Excuse me, Dr. Sloan, could you give me an 3 examples of a self-evident truth?
Yes. All bachelors are unmarried would be an example of a self-evident truth. Another is everything is identical to itself. A third is the law of non-contradiction, that there are no true contradictions. And I'll give a fourth, the transitivity of identity. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. And I'll throw in a fifth just for kicks. Nothing begins to exist without a cause.
No.
Question for the negative?
Oh, okay. I was a little bit confused at one point with respect to the fact that our esteemed philosophers on the negative side seem to be arguing opposite points about the existence of God. JT started off with the point that the universe didn't look like it was conducive for design and talked about how we know of intelligent life in a minuscule part of the universe separated by all other parts, whether rational or irrational, by great distances. Then Matt, in his discussion, appealed to Drake's equation at one point with respect to the idea that belief in God might be comparable to alien abduction, not induction, excuse me. And, of course, the notion of Drake's equation is that the universe is teeming with intelligent life. So it seemed to me that you were making opposite points. So my question is, which is the argument against theism? That there's too little intelligent life, or that there's too much, or I just didn't quite follow that.
My original point was that the universe does not look as though it is designed for life, which is what we'd expect on the God hypothesis. The example I used was if you took all the places in the universe where life can thrive and reduce them to a speck in this room, you'd never find the speck. Now, even if the universe is teeming with life, as in there's lots of life-supporting planets, that doesn't change the fact that this universe we live in is a radiation-filled vacuum that is almost universally lethal to life. You could have tons of places where life exists, and in fact, I think we do. But that doesn't change the fact that the sum of all those places is still so astronomically small that you could not possibly conclude that the universe was designed to sustain life.
Hi, my question is for John Ferrer, and I'm just curious on your position on what the scientific community has named RNA world, dealing with the experiment in the 50s, which replicated the conditions of early Earth, and all the elements of life, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and one other one I can't think of, was placed in a closed system. A volt of electricity was applied, and it created proteins and amino acids, which are the building blocks for nucleic acids. These nucleic acids were eventually clumped together, they're attracted to each other, and they form chains eventually of RNA. What is your position on that? Do you believe that that is true or false?
Well, for one, I fully expect that intelligence designing an experiment can produce things that look like the building blocks from which material that could animate could happen. But the idea that it takes a designer to produce design is what we're postulating, not what they're postulating. Second, the Miller-Urey experiment that you're talking about is widely, I mean, it's popular in high school and some college textbooks now, but as far as its evidential value, what they found is that the early Earth environment, to the best inferential estimates we can make scientifically and archaeologically, didn't look anything like that. He actually found chemicals that would be the most conducive and least hostile to the formation of the building blocks for proteins, basic amino acids. Moreover, I would say just because you can produce a brick, even if you could produce a brick, is a long way from producing a house. And it's precisely this extra element that we postulate that materialistic naturalism has no real account for, namely the non-material yet nonetheless real something that is information. Information has this unique attribute that all of its parts are entirely interchangeable. I could say something in English and the exact same meaning could have different letters. It could be in sound waves, it could be written, it could be visual, it could be felt, and yet the same meaning is preserved through all of that. Materialism, I'm not prepared to say that is strictly a rebuttal to all of atheistic naturalism, but that's at least a real challenge to reductive materialist accounts. And so the Miller-Urey experiment doesn't really account for much of anything except to show that designers can produce design.
Matt brought up the issue of the person David Hume, who I'm a big fan of as well. But one of the things that David Hume said was that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. In other words, that we have intuitive feelings about how we think the universe ought to work, and that reason sort of comes along behind it and bolsters it and tries to systematize it, but at the end, it's sort of our intuitions judging what is right and what is wrong, and we use reason only to buttress that, but we're never changing minds when we do that. When we use reason, we always have to use intuition. And my question is, it seems like there's certain intuitions at work here. For example, the intuition that there must be a God because without a God there wouldn't be any morality. Well, if morality is just a human construct, well, why couldn't it be a human construct? And or on the question of the science has never found, we've always found better explanations, so why is it, well, that's a myopic question. That you're saying, okay, science has won every time. Well, no matter how many times science wins, it could still lose someday. So my question is, when we have these intuitive feelings about how these appealings to our intuition about how things ought to work, isn't there an argument to be made for a more robust sort of diversity where there are people where we will find better truth when some people believe in God and some people don't?
So I think that the way that I look at Hume with regard to reason and intuition is that the best use of reason is to hone our intuitions and improve them so that they serve as better guides based on the evidence that's produced. That's how I take the bulk of, or that's my interpretation of the bulk of what Hume is actually getting at. I'm not a fan of the phrasing of, being the reason being a slave to the intuitions. You're right, science could lose someday, and as soon as it does, that's when we'll be justified in believing alternate explanations. It's not like nobody is refusing to test supernatural claims. Happens all the time. As soon as somebody makes a testable claim, we're generally happy to test it. James Randi Educational Foundation's got $1 million prize for anybody who can demonstrate anything supernatural, and oddly enough, the money just keeps going unclaimed. Excuses are given, but and who doesn't think that demonstrating? I mean, if a God exists, there's two options in this particular category: is that this God interacts with reality, manifests in some way, or doesn't. If God doesn't interact or manifest in reality in some way, that's indistinguishable from a God that doesn't exist. They're logically equivalent as far as I can tell, and I have no justification for believing one. But if a God does manifest in reality, that's something that theoretically can be detected and tested. And yet we see millions and millions of people who seem to live their life with the belief that God actually does answer prayer, heal people, do all sorts of things that are ostensibly detectable and testable. And yet when tested, these claims repeatedly fail. So in that second category of God, the God who manifests in reality, you have additional options, and that is that either there's mistakes being made, or perhaps this God is intentionally monkeying with the tests to hide himself. And I'd argue that a God that hides itself is indistinguishable from one that doesn't exist as well.
Add on to that. You cite my argument on trend in discovered knowledge. Science is won every time. And you seem to kind of be on board with that because your response was, but science could still lose someday. If you're going to base your argument on what we might one day find, you're definitionally not basing your beliefs on what we currently know. That's a bad way to go about formulating beliefs for anybody, atheist, theist alike. We can only base our beliefs on what we presently know. And if you're saying we might discover something in the future that confirms I'm right, that is a recipe for being wrong that has been used effectively since man first crawled out of the ooze.
Okay, my question is mainly directed at Sloan because he was talking about the objective morality and he brought up evolutionary development in humans and how that is used as a possible explanation for objective morality. But my question is really that I'm willing to concede that within the human species, our morality is objective to us, but we don't apply that same morality to other animals. In fact, it's been shown that other animals have their own sets of morality. For instance, it's perfectly acceptable for lions to go and invade another lion's territory and kill its cubs. Like, we don't see anything particularly wrong with that, but we would if we were humans. So basically, it's objective like within our species, but when you account for all living species, and since humans are animals, it's subjective when you apply it to other species. So how can it be truly objective and be based on an objective, I forgot how you put it, groundwork, if without humans or a similar animal that evolved like us, without humans, that our particular morality that you continually reference does not exist.
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks. To get at your question, I'd first go to the issue of animals having alternate moralities or moral systems. That strikes me as being sort of an unhappy way to describe these sorts of considerations. A necessary condition for being a moral agent of any sort, human or non-human, is knowledge and ability to seek the good. Knowledge that there is a good and that there's an obligation to seek it. So the short answer there is I would argue that animals are non-moral and humans are moral or can be moral. And so that there was a fundamental problem in the phrasing of the question. If we found another species, alien species, say, that could reason, use the principles of logic, and seem to indicate that that they were aware that there's an objective good and that it ought to be pursued, well then, I wouldn't have any trouble conferring upon them the status of moral agents. So, yeah.
I'd like to add to that. In regards to evolutionary accounts for ethics, nature is red in tooth and claw. It kills everything. So in a very brutal sense, evolution isn't going to tell us what should be. It can only tell us what is. And it's a harsh what is. Nature grossly discriminates. It picks out the wimpy and the frail and tends to kill them off first. Nature is mindless, therefore any morality would be accidental, not intentional. Still hasn't addressed the naturalistic fallacy. You're going to have an ought in nature for our oughts to have a reference point and to be true. What you described calling objectivism is actually trans-subjectivism, which is really just a form of cultural relativism. Jumps illicitly from what is normal to what is normative. It explains only a few selfless behaviors and not enough to cover all human morals. Filters only for survival, not for truth. And a good lie can add more survival value than truth. Yet we have this stubborn conviction that we can know things about truth. And then it doesn't filter for goodness or for beauty, which my colleague helped to bring up. We are opponents in other regards, just not here. Yeah.
So one of the things that Sloan had actually brought up in his opening statement was that the experience of aesthetics lends weight to the idea that a God exists. Now, JT, you gave us a wonderful example of a beautiful operatic song just before. So I'm wondering, how do you, in an atheistic world, how do you explain the existence of beauty and our experience of it?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a bit of a cheat, I think. By the way, when the Q&A is over, there's also discussion as well. Okay. Then I won't consider this a cheat because technically he's asking us to give a rebuttal to a point that you made that we didn't actually rebut. There's a number of things that I actually agree with Sloan on, and one of the things that I like to do is admit when I'm wrong or when I've misstated something. And the absolute statement that I made about not believing anything until it's demonstrated was a claim that was a statement I was making with regard to existential claims that were being discussed, not about intrinsic transcendent truths like the logical absolutes. For clarity. Beauty, though, is one area where I think I would disagree with Sloan in that I don't see the justification for claiming that it's objective. I think it's far more plausible that we are evolved to appreciate the things, this is going to seem circular, but I'm sorry, appreciate the things that we appreciate. In other words, if anybody's ever seen an ant really close up under a microscope, man, those are ugly. There are people who actually would find that beautiful. I imagine there's lots of bug people who'd find it really great. Certainly another ant, if they had the capability, and I don't know whether they have the capability of processing things like beauties, but certainly they'd find it attractive. But I don't think it's fair to say that we can conclude, even if they have that capacity, that an ant would find, for example, the painting on the Sistine Chapel beautiful, or would be able to appreciate it in any way, which to me, kind of shooes away the idea that beauty is itself objective. As far as I can tell, everything about me says that beauty is subjective, that it's a construct. It's a way of us saying, hey, this is what I like to look at. And the reason we find we have somewhat ubiquitous agreement about beauty within humans is roughly the same reason that we have somewhat ubiquitous understandings of morals. And that's because we've evolved as products of the people who appreciated the things that we appreciate.
And I'll throw my own bit on that. You said you found it beautiful. I don't find opera that beautiful. It's not that appealing to me, which is really weird. But that just goes to show that it's not subjective. What is beauty? Beauty is the brain in a certain configuration that gives us this feeling of awe, or this feeling of happiness, or whatever you interpret when you think of beauty. In my case, I'm a music theorist. While beauty isn't consistent to everybody, once more, you thought opera is beautiful. I think it's not that entertaining. Styx and NSYNC. But there are certain things that tend to work for a lot of people. A lot of people find the stars beautiful. Some people find them boring, but most people find them beautiful. And it's just these inputs that put your brain into a configuration where you have increased dopamine levels, increased serotonin levels, increased norepinephrine levels. Say that 3 times fast. But there are natural stimuli that can do this. In the case of music, there's a system of describing what tones go into various notes called the overtone system. And certain combinations, like major chords, tend to put people's brains into that state where they're like, oh, that's beautiful. And certain combinations, like diminished chords, make you go, ugh, to where if I were to end a song on a diminished chord, you would probably want to punch me in the face, because you're like, no, that needs to go to a major chord or something like that. But we can look at that and we can see, what things tend to put people into that state. So why is it beautiful to me? Because it changes my brain in a way that makes me feel good, but might not make someone else feel good.
I'm contractually obligated to say that my wife is objectively beautiful.
I'm contractually obligated as his lecherous friend with no moral compass to agree.
Okay. Yes, directed at John Ferrer, sorry. You made an argument dealing with the universe and comparing it to a basketball, and I assume you were talking about the idea of the oscillating universes, and the whole basketball demonstration was to talk about the second law of thermodynamics, that it would lose energy and run out, and we would have a dead universe. And I just wanted to point out and get your reaction to this, that's a misunderstanding of the second law of thermodynamics, because the second law of thermodynamics applies to an open system where energy is lost. With a closed system like a universe, the energy would not be lost. Now your reaction.
Actually, I'd like to be the one to respond to that, if that's all right. Actually, the second law of thermodynamics says, as you put it, in a closed system, the total amount of mass energy neither increases nor decreases. Right, but the question with respect to the universe is, it's an open question as to whether it's a closed system or not. And, well, look, if God exists, then it clearly is an open system. And so you're begging the question. If you want to beg the question, that's, well, okay. But if God can infuse more energy into the universe, then it's not a closed system. And with respect to the oscillation issue, we would expect that if the universe were oscillating in the way you suggested, that the expansion rate of the universe would be decreasing. But in the early 2000s, the Wilkinson microwave background radiation probe discovered just the opposite, that the expansion rate of the universe is in fact increasing, which is right. Okay, well, perhaps some of the others.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and let him answer the question because we need to move on.
So, yeah.
And I would like to add that the mechanism to generate that contraction, I don't know that there has been anything demonstrated sufficient that would operate on that extent.
We don't have a consensus.
There's no consensus on that, and hence, even though they may conclude about all of nature, which, by the way, is the purview, I dare say, should I say it, is the purview of meta-science and not science per se, because to fit the universe into even a conjectural experiment is pretty grand and pretty hard to achieve any kind of testability. So it's right at that borderline between science and philosophy where you're doing that meta-science, and that's why there's so little agreement on some of those things. But as far as the closeness and openness of the universe, it would be an appeal to popularity to say that most scientists agree, because I don't know how they could know that.
Okay, if we do have questions for the negative assertion, please feel free to line up on the other side.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Pleased to meet you.
That was part one. Part two. If we have a moral lawgiver, and the moral lawgiver is intrinsically good, and he bestows upon the world this moral law goodness, then it would seem that he's not a moral lawgiver, but some sort of moral law messenger, as he was intrinsically good and he did not create the goodness. Now, the converse is even more absurd, and if we say that the moral lawgiver was not intrinsically good, but chose to create the sense of moral goodness in itself, then we might question whether the decision to create moral goodness was of arbitrary moral value.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I'd like to hear more about what you, maybe afterwards, hear more about what you had in mind when you talk about something being intrinsically good. Depending on what you mean by that, it could go in different ways. But the one thing I did want to point out is that I didn't present a moral argument in which God is a moral lawgiver. And in fact, I tried to be very explicit. Maybe I wasn't explicit enough, that the moral standard on this version of the moral argument exists even if God doesn't. So that wasn't, now John presented another kind of moral argument, and I think he would want to address that. So.
For one thing, I don't affirm divine command theory, which am I right in saying that you are elaborating on the Euthyphro dilemma or variation on that?
No, it didn't sound like.
Okay. When you said that God either communicates a moral something that I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Can you clarify the nature of your question, because it's kind of long. I lost track a point somewhere in there.
If we derive our moral sense at all from some sort of moral lawgiver, whether if it's just in the form of a moral command, or whether through whatever means he gives it to us, that we have some sense of moral goodness, then it would seem that we have this dilemma between whether he had intrinsic moral goodness and was in fact not the originator of moral goodness, or whether actually the motion of creating moral goodness itself was of arbitrary moral goodness in itself.
What you have expressed, whether you know it or not, is a brand of the Euthyphro dilemma, which is this classic moral argument, which does effectively challenge, I'm not prepared to say it defeats it, but it challenges divine command theory, but that's not the position I hold. The idea that a being can be intrinsically good and yet somehow we have to figure out some other source for goodness, that doesn't make sense to me. For example, you said God would not be the moral giver, but the moral messenger. Am I my own messenger? Well, I am intrinsic to myself. And so I don't know what that means. It sounds like we're mixing categories. The gist of the moral argument is that for there to be moral truths in this world that are objectively true, that is, they're not binding merely on group agreement, even if all of humanity happened to agree, not binding on mere cultural agreement, family, local, or individual agreement, but they can be true even if all of those levels disagree. Unless there's an ought in nature then there must be an ought elsewhere. And the reason for postulating a mind, I take the inference of Richard Carrier and Sam Harris, who grant in their books, The Moral Landscape and Sense and Goodness Without God, they grant that morality is a stuff of mind. So we have to get a mind somewhere. And if human minds only justify relativism, then it seems to make sense to say that there is a being that is the grounding for good. Now, that would still allow a kind of relativism because it's all relative to God. But I'm okay with that because that's still transcultural and achieves objective grounding for us.
Right. And I want to add some more. Yeah, since you were able to elaborate a little bit about what you meant about intrinsic goodness there, it seemed to me that the argument you want to advance says something like this: either God follows the moral law, and that the moral law is then independent of God, and that's supposed to be a problem for theists, or God makes up the moral law arbitrarily and then just dictates what is right and wrong, and then that's supposed to be a problem for the theist. But it was this phrase of, now, some theists try to split the horns of that dilemma and say that God is by nature good, and so that the goodness of God is intrinsic to God. So the language that you actually used there was the language of somebody who would respond to the dilemma by saying, well, look, this is a way to split between the horns of that dilemma, to say that God is intrinsically good. Then there will be, then the dilemma is then not problematic.
God.
God would be the source of moral goodness, but it wouldn't be as if God could command just anything.
Perhaps I can illustrate this. Imagine you could create your own little dollhouse with little fully functioning automatons in that dollhouse, and you can program them with your standards and whatnot that are consistent with your being, with your character, because it's not going to come from someone else; it's coming from you. Relative to you, that little experiment, the way they operate as you program them. Now, this is a deterministic model, so there's strong limitations to this. But let's say you could create them to be able to make some choices, but you still give them moral binding. You would be the God, so to speak, for that scenario. And we don't have to say what caused good beyond you if you're creating something there. Now, that would be a divine command theory, but that's sufficient to explain your point. I go even deeper and say it's not just a creation of God, it's intrinsic to him. It's true of him because he's a mind.
All right, we're going to go ahead and end there. Thank you for your questions. Sorry we won't be able to get to any more of your questions. We're going to go to free-form discussion. And in a free-form discussion, this is where the actual debate participants will engage one another more directly. And they were obviously vigorously taking notes as your questions were coming forth. And, of course, we'll see how this free-form discussion goes. With that,
They're totally being put up to something.
I said free-form discussion, not free-for-all.
Someone's putting them up to it.
Before we go any further, one person that hasn't gotten a round of applause is Steve, our moderator.
Yes.
I've done a lot of debates in my life, and he's one of the best moderators I've ever worked with. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. And with that, I will open up to free-form. You may begin.
Is there an objection, since you guys got so many questions? I wanted to...
Yeah, you can lead off. Sure.
When the modified version of the Euthyphro dilemma came up, obviously there's not a lot of reason to spend a lot of time on it if nobody's advocating divine command theory, although in much the same way that you're baffled at how I can have my moral positions and not devolve into moral relativism, I'm baffled at how you can how you can get around divine command theory. But the analogy that I've often used when we talk about morality and how I view it as possibly objective, because this idea that, well, you said even if everybody agreed, everybody in the entire species agreed on something, first, we know that's not going to happen, but I would agree with you that doesn't dictate what is or isn't moral. My position is that everybody could be wrong, and we may be all wrong about what is actually morally correct. We're probably not wrong about most things, but there's always the possibility that we're wrong, because these are truths that we derive about who we are and who we are with relation to the universe in which we live. And so a chess game is the example that I've used before. If you pulled up a mid-game position and showed it to a bunch of chess masters or grandmasters or whatever, you might get a variety of answers about what's the best move. And it may be the case that many of those moves are in fact the best move, because they lead to equivalent results, at least as far as we're able to see. And those that can see further, which I would argue we can see further than our ancestors, could maybe tell you which moves are better and explain why. But we can also say that the individual who decides to tip over their king has clearly made a move that is not the best move. And these are all objective standards with relation to the rules of the game of chess. They're not contingent upon any mind, other than the rules, which I would say are analogous to nature and our place in it. And so the ability to evaluate positions and come to conclusions about what is beneficial, I don't think requires anything more than a reasoning and a look at. It's not entirely consequentialism I'm advocating. I'm advocating something akin to what Sam Harris advocates in Moral Landscape, where there are a variety of different positions, but given a finite set of possible actions, there is some action or some collection of actions that represent the moral pinnacle that aren't contingent upon any individual's mind. And that includes temporally speaking, so that, like we can say that those who kept slaves in the past were wrong to keep slaves, even if everybody agreed at the time that slaves were okay, which I don't think was ever the case, because if you ask the slaves, I bet they probably weren't okay with it, most of them, some of them.
You mentioned Sam Harris, and earlier I gave reasons why evolution is an insufficient grounding framework to give rise to moral oughts like we have. We have this tremendously transcendent, glorious sense of what ought to be, and yet nature is red in tooth and claw. And when we look at the progress of evolution, when we look at the progress of human history, what we see is not overwhelming morality. Morality oftentimes is localized and utilitarian and so on. But when you mention Sam Harris also makes the claim in the Moral Landscape that minds are brains, and he postulates biological determinism, which I would like to point out that in that connection, he threatens to poison the well of atheism entire, because if minds are identical to brains or are emergent from brains or reducible to brains, what you end up with is your ability to think, to reason, to come to moral conclusions is itself a necessary consequence of a long line of mechanistic natural forces, nature and nurture. And if you are coerced by force of nature and nurture, then I've got no real reason to trust your testimony if you're bearing witness under coercion. I mean, that's Sam Harris's conclusion. I'm not trying to poison the well. I'm pointing out that he did by drawing that conclusion. Not to mention he falls into the same relativistic, consequentialist traps that
actually, no, Sam is vehemently in opposition to moral relativism. It's one of a hand. Well, we're in agreement in a number of areas. Sam is as opposed to moral relativism as I am, and I don't think I'm out of line for speaking for him, because it's clear in the book. But let me just hit this one point real quick, and that is this constant raising of the is-ought problem. I'll concede that it may be the case that you can't get from an is to an ought, but you can certainly get from two ises to an ought, and that's the situation that I think we have when we're talking about morality. This is the situation I'm in. This is the beneficial goal. This is what I ought to do.
Yeah, the problem with that is that you've switched from means in reasoning to moral, or you've conflated means in reasoning with moral reasoning. And following Kant's terminology on this, that there's a real difference between the conditional imperative versus the categorical imperative. And if we're going to try to reduce categorical imperatives or moral imperatives to conditional imperatives about means ends reasoning, then perhaps if that the morality is, some would say that the purpose of morality is to produce happiness. Well, then this would suggest that the answer to the question or to the claim, one ought to be moral, then a Richard Carrier would want to say, well, this should be expressed as an if-then clause. Well, then, if one wants to be happy, then one ought to do things that are considered moral. But then, whether one wants to be happy or not is irrelevant to whether one ought to be moral or not. One has a categorical imperative to be moral, not just a conditional imperative to be moral. And that's my complaint about Sam Harris and Richard Carrier as well, is they just have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of morality.
And I would point out, you're right, Harris denies consequentialism and then proceeds to explain and defend consequentialism, just showing that I don't think he understands
Actually, what I said was that
relativism.
Sam Harris opposes moral relativism. I didn't talk about his position on consequentialism.
Okay, he opposes relativism and then proceeds to deny any objective grounding for that to get from any combination of ises to an ought, because those reduce to description, whereas prescription is a different category. It's a category mistake. It's an oversimplification. And then, as Sloan pointed out, if you try to go from a hypothetical imperative, from a if you want this, if you want to be happy, then do this, that's consequentialism.
Okay, Sam's not here to defend himself.
Well, you're affirming his position, so I can.
No,
I can
I'm
direct
saying
it
that
towards
in
you.
general. Okay, I gave a lecture on the superiority of secular morality for about 2 years. I stopped doing it when Sam came out with his book because, by and large, I'm okay with his position. But I'm not Sam, and I can't really speak for Sam. What I can say is that what I recall Sam saying is not. And I know that he's in opposition to moral relativism because he directly says so.
Good.
But on the consequentialism issue, what he's said is that he is not advocating simple consequentialism. There's no denying that what he's advocating is a sort of consequentialism. Whether or not we find it valid, I guess we can have a whole nother debate
So we
on
deny
morality
like Mill
at some
and
point.
Bentham's form, but maybe nuance it with some objective.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to change the subject.
Can I throw? I didn't get to do the whole moral thing.
Sure.
Oh, because you're immoral.
Well, no, because I didn't understand half the words you guys were using. I'm the music major. This is just an appeal to the audience real quick. Look at what the two hypotheses predict. If God exists and he gave us this moral impulse, why all the confusion? Like, if God made it, he would want us to have at least some consensus on what is this objective morality, and we don't have it. It seems like if God exists, he prioritized confusing us over giving us a legitimate moral impulse. However, if God doesn't exist, what do we expect to see? We expect to see a bunch of people with desires trying to figure out how to best achieve those desires. Well, desires like happiness, like we're a bunch of people who have realized that a world in which everybody murders their neighbors, rapes their pets, and steals their pornography is not a world in which we have shared happiness. And we would also expect to see different moral ideas. Such a system, created by minds, human minds, wouldn't be perfect, but it can't be because we're flawed. But it's what we have, and we do the best we can. We can't make the world a utopian one. We can only do the best we have, and that's what we see.
Yeah, the problem there is, we're running out of time, and there is a problem there.
We'll take this to the blogs.
In fact, as a moderator, let's go ahead and move to a different subject. We've got about 5 minutes left.
You suggested that, right, we're both engaged in the search for truth, and we have reason as a tool, but we disagree on the standards of evidence. It seemed to me that you were discounting argument and a priori reason as a means of evidence. And it seemed, Dillahunty, and it seemed to me that now you didn't come out and put it this way, but it seemed to me you were strongly suggesting that the only legitimate means of evidence is empirical evidence. And the problem with that is that's self-defeating. There's no empirical evidence that we have that the only legitimate means of evidence that we have is empirical evidence. So, and
There's no empirical evidence that the only...
the only valid kind of evidence there is empirical evidence.
Sure, and I'm not advocating that the only valid evidence is empirical evidence for all claims. This is what I was talking about before.
Well, then it's
when I
not
talked
clear
about-
to me that we disagree on our standards of evidence.
Well, okay, then we disagree on the category in which perhaps God should fit. Because when it comes to existential claims, that is where I would hold that empirical evidence.
Yeah, so this
is the
this
only
would be
thing sufficient.
this is often advanced against the ontological argument that you can't go merely from a priori reasoning to determine whether or not something exists. But this, I think, is false because we do this all the time with respect to the negative cases. If somebody came in here and said, there's a married bachelor, a bachelor out in the hallway. Well, I know just through a priori reflection alone, there is no such thing in the hallway, and I've determined, with respect to an existential matter, what doesn't exist and what can't exist. And the ontological argument claims to be a positive case instance of this.
Yeah, and see that I'd say that I have no problem at all with definitionally demonstrating that something doesn't exist by contradiction.
No,
but
you don't define a bachelor as
bachelor and married are definitionally mutually exclusive terms.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is how you can conclude that it doesn't exist.
That's right.
I object to the claim that you can define a God into existence.
Yes, and I would agree with that. The first premise of the ontological argument is not that God is an existent being. You would need the rest of the argument.
Correct.
The first premise of the argument is that God is that than which nothing greater could be conceived.
Right. And the continuation of the ontological argument is that it proposes that existence is necessarily a property of greatness, or that a maximally great being, or the greatest conceivable being, a being which exists is necessarily greater than one which doesn't. And what I find in that, this is me,
that's not a premise of theism, that's a premise of Platonism.
Sorry, what?
That's a Platonic premise.
I'm talking about the specific argument, and when I look at it, what I see is an attempt to define, by the entire argument, not just premise one, define a being into existence. Maybe I am
Look, if I was trying to define...
Hang on just a second, because I'm going to concede.
Okay.
Maybe I am just rather simplistic in my view of the ontological argument, and I'd be happy to consider more about it. But I have no problem with determining that something doesn't exist by definition when the definitions violate the three logical laws of thought. I have a very big problem with determining that something exists because our definitions of our conceptions of it are such that existence is included.
If I understand Sloan correctly, and we've argued about the ontological argument significantly ourselves, all that needs to be shown for it to work is that a being that which can't be surpassed must be metaphysically coherent, not exist. It must be something that is possible. Once you grant its possibility, then the argument logically follows. But the only real point I can tell to object is you haven't used yet.
I wanted to change the subject again.
Sure. You have 20 seconds.
Before we go on,
I wanted to ask you a question.
Hold on.
Oh, sure.
Next time we're having a debate over music theory, because I feel like a fifth wheel over here.
Well, I wanted to ask you a particular question. You had mentioned...
Ask me in English, please. I don't understand what you guys are saying.
It was a point you brought up, and I'm just asking for clarification.
Yeah. No
you had mentioned that Lease Molin's theory, fecund universe theory, had been modified, and I was just wanted you to suggest a resource that I could go and look at on that issue, an article, a book, a paper, whatever.
Start with Wikipedia. I discussed this with my astronomy teacher from back in college. We're still in touch.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever something like this comes up, I defer to him because I'm a music major, not an astronomer or a physicist. And I don't understand how they reach a lot of those conclusions, but I don't feel like I have to. As long as the experts understand something, I need to admit my ignorance and defer to them, especially on things like physics and biology. We don't live long enough to become experts on everything. And if I were to say, nope, I know more about physics than the physicists, I'd be a real arrogant jerk.
Yeah, that's why I want you to direct me to
let's go to a wrap
particular
up.
physicists.
Maybe you can find it and put on the blog.
You could email it to me.
Yeah, I'll totally put it on
sure.
my blog.
Sure, if it's short.
It's really short because it relates to something John said in answer to a question where they were asking about, you assumed that they were talking about the Miller-Urey experiments, and said that this demonstrates that, scientists can create something. That's not quite what the Miller-Urey experiments demonstrate, but the Miller-Urey experiments are not the sum total of investigation into abiogenesis, and I'd recommend looking at the work of John Oro and others. It's John, and I don't know if there's an H in his end or not. Juan Oro, and I'll get it to you in email. But the
first letter, the last name.
Oh, we're going to go ahead and wrap up.
Then I'll wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually what I thought she was talking about. It was in 1961. Juan Oro left ammonium and hydrogen cyanide to stew in an aqueous solution that resembled the prebiotic Earth. And those elements we know were in the prebiotic atmosphere, as was montmorillonite clay, and it produced adenine. Likewise, cytosine can be synthesized from running an electrical current through. I actually think I got it in notes somewhere.
Pretty good for a music major.
Well, we'll take a look at that later. We do have to move. We do have a schedule.
Okay.
I would like us to give our thanks to the participants for our debate today. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Kevin.
All right, Steve Lee, everyone.